I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a couple concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. And speaking of making a difference, while most podcasts are funded through sponsors or ad revenue, we at Climate Optimists rely heavily on our listener donations to bring you the programming we hear each week. So, if you are a regular listener and like what you hear from us, consider a donation that aligns with that value. All you have to do is head to our website, climateoptimist.co, and click the donate button. I promise it's easy. So for most people, it's probably not a shocker to learn that Exxon and Chevron top the list of companies who do the most to obstruct climate action. However, it might come as a surprise to hear that Toyota ranks third behind those two oil giants. And why is Toyota spending money to block action while other automakers are, moving to fully electric fleet? We think it's a great question and one we thought we would spend a short episode exploring. So I wasn't aware of Toyota being a climate obstructionist until really this last year. There's a great UK-based nonprofit called Influence Map that is focused on exposing companies and interest groups that are obstructing climate action. And it was their report that I read and saw Toyota was number 3 on the list of companies that are doing the most to obstruct climate policy.
Yeah, I mean, this one really had me baffled because when I think of Toyota, and I think this is probably true for a lot of people, I think of, the Toyota Prius.
Right.
And was really like, in some ways, kind of like a really big step toward environmentalism and fuel economy. And so when this story came out, I was like, why would Toyota, of all companies, be in this category?
Right.
And Thomas, I know you have an interesting, perspective on some of the history here. Australia's kind of even tied up in this story in some ways. And I was just wondering if you could, give us some of the history with Toyota in Japan, in general.
Yeah, I think it's one of those situations where it's sort of a multifaceted root cause that brought them to their position that they're at today. And a lot of it goes back to, I think, the Fukushima disaster in 2011 and the fact that the support for nuclear power in Japan has really waned since then, of course. And although Japan has a relatively low CO2 emission per kilowatt hour for their electricity, any new electricity that's been added to the grid in Japan is typically done through fossil fuels now. They've got 22 coal-fired power stations either under construction or planned to be constructed in the near future. So any new electricity demand you add to that grid results in significant CO2 emissions. And it's the same thing with their position on hydrogen. They've been very supportive of hydrogen for a long time, and that is partially because the Japanese are sort of the world leaders in manufacturing fuel cells, be it hydrogen or natural gas-based fuel cells, and they want to import that hydrogen from other sources. And the CO2 emissions for the production of that hydrogen, if it is made from black and brown hydrogen sources, i.e. from like coal and gas, that counts against the nation from which they import it. The combustion or running that hydrogen through a fuel cell within Japan doesn't count against them. So they've been heavily invested because of their specific geopolitical situation in either hybrid internal combustion engine vehicles or hydrogen fuel cells. And there hasn't been a big demand for battery electric in Japan. And they've kind of tried to force that on the rest of the world when that is not the case in the rest of the world. The rest of the world is far more suited to battery electric.
Interesting.
So in a way, Thomas, it's like Japan made this, they had Fukushima, they went a different direction, moved away from nuclear. They invested heavily in, hybrid technology and in fuel cells, and fuel cells that consume hydrogen. And so it all kind of funneled together into their solution being, hey, let's run our economy on hydrogen and unfortunately produce that hydrogen, at least today, from coal and natural gas that's emitting a ton of carbon up into the atmosphere. So while hydrogen can get credit for being clean when it burns, just being water out the tailpipe, you're still in the meantime putting all this carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere to create it.
Yeah, I think the other thing too to keep in mind is that it's really difficult for Japan to manufacture or produce renewable energy, unlike the US and Australia, where we have ample roof area for solar panels, and we've got wide open spaces for wind turbines, and even shallow waters offshore for offshore wind turbines. Japan doesn't have that luxury, and so it makes it really difficult for them if they're going to move away from nuclear power to go, well, look, let's pivot towards renewables. It's very, very hard situation for them. And geopolitically, it doesn't really suit them to drop a cable in the sea and run it across to China, because they're frightened that China could flick the switch off at any time.
So it kind of seems like it's not really that Toyota is really that anti EV. It's just they're very pro hydrogen fuel cell. I mean, that's the way I look at it, because they've thrown so many of their eggs in that basket. I think the hydrogen thing is really cool, but when you look at it for autos, it's not that efficient in comparison to battery.
It's terrible.
I think there's some pluses on it, like the refueling time. I think you can refuel in about the same time you can refuel a gasoline car, right?
Yeah, if you had somewhere to refuel.
Well, that's the
Yeah,
problem, right?
but
There's no
there's nowhere to
stations.
refuel these things.
Right.
And those stations they're outrageous to build these stations. It's not just like tapping a charger into the already available electric grid.
Well, and let's be clear. I mean, it's unfortunate that Japan made these technological decisions, and we're hoping to export that to the rest of the world. But it's obviously completely unacceptable for a corporation to be trying to get in the way of these solutions that we so desperately need, purely because they want to keep their shareholders happy. It's not to let other automakers off the hook, because there are others out there, but Toyota is absolutely the worst of the worst when it comes to climate policy, and they've just continued to kind of drag their feet. And at some point, they'll be forced to make the shift. But I guess that's where I feel like, as consumers, we have the opportunity to exert some pressure and hopefully help them make the shift sooner.
And I think that shift has begun within Toyota. I mean, you look at the Toyota Mirai sales. The Toyota Mirai is a fuel cell vehicle. It's been on sale for quite some time in the US now. Just looking from January to May this year, they've sold 1,100 of them. Tesla has sold 179,000 electric vehicles in the same time in the US. So it's just they just haven't gained any traction with hydrogen fuel cells. And so they've pivoted towards now making full battery electric. And they released recently the BZ4X in the US for sale. But they've also just announced a recall on every single one of them, because literally the wheels are falling off the vehicle.
Yeah. Well, this hydrogen thing is really interesting to me all around. And I know there's a lot of other applications, obviously, besides cars. It'd be cool. And I know you've got a lot of knowledge on this, Thomas, and it would be cool we could do a whole episode, I think, on hydrogen fuel cells and hydrogen. But
We should.
we should. But I don't want to dive into that rabbit hole too far. So, Jason, how do you think Toyota ranks amongst the other automakers?
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously harping on Toyota pretty hard, and for good reason. But there's a lot of other automakers that have come late and dragged their feet as well. And I was talking about Influence Map earlier, and their report that they just released on the automotive sector is fascinating. And the executive summary is really the only car makers that are kind of in the realm of acceptable when it comes to climate policy are Tesla, not surprisingly, and Volkswagen. Tesla gets a B. They rate Volkswagen a C, and then you've got Ford and GM in like a C minus category. So, when you look beyond those four automakers, really the rest are in the D plus category, and that includes the other Japanese major auto manufacturers, Honda and Nissan. And then you've got the rest of, the German auto manufacturers and Stellantis. And again, Toyota at the very bottom of that list. So Toyota is the worst for sure, but there are other auto manufacturers that have been, obstructing climate policy as well.
Where in the hell are the Australian automakers on here? What what is that, Vauxhall? Who's the...
Sort of. So they used to be partners with Holden Motors under the General Motors banner, but they've shut all the manufacturing down here now. We were a little slow to adapt. We were still making monstrous V8 powered, vehicles that nobody really wanted to buy anymore, and we couldn't understand why. But anyway, the world's moved on.
Well, I guess maybe the opposite of your question, Todd, which is worth asking, is like, are there manufacturers who are kind of leaders, right? And Tesla is an obvious one, whether or not you're a fan of Elon Musk, and I can't say I am. But, you know, I think, Thomas, hasn't Volvo done some good things as well? I mean, both Tesla and Volvo feel like they're definitely in the more leading than lagging category.
Yeah, I think you take well Volvo's focus with its Polestar brand. They've worked really hard to try and make that as a environmentally responsible electric vehicle as possible, and they've moved their facilities operations to running on renewable energy and trying to use recycled product wherever possible in the manufacturing of the vehicles. I do have a bit of a beef for the fact that their cars electricity consumption compared to a Tesla is quite a bit higher. So that means that you've got to have larger battery packs and so forth to travel the same distance, which all has a environmental footprint associated with it. But no, they're definitely of all the car manufacturers beyond Tesla, they're the one probably taking the greatest step in the right direction.
Yeah. So, what do we do to get sort of the rest of the pack here up to speed as far as these automakers go in moving to, to electric vehicle?
You know, Thomas, I'll be interested to hear your perspective here. For me, I think one of the key pieces is having these phase out dates for internal combustion engines. So, Europe was able to put in a 2035 date when they're saying no more, internal combustion engines will be sold after that. Uh, it made a huge difference. Speaking of Toyota, in terms of their forecast. So you look at the United States, we don't have a phase out date yet. Europe does, and Toyota's EV forecast for 2029, so not that far away. They're forecasting that they'll be selling 50% of their vehicles as battery electric into Europe and only 3% in the US. Now, I don't know if there's other elements that impact that, but it seems to me like having these phase out dates are really the best way to turn the screws on the automakers.
Yeah, I think to add to that, companies like Tesla need to continue to make vehicles that are more compelling than the internal combustion equivalents. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, when people go and purchase a new vehicle, they're thinking about a lot of different factors, and one of them is like, well, what are the long-term operating costs of this vehicle? And so, if you can operate a Tesla for 1/8 the cost of an equivalent petrol powered or gasoline powered vehicle, it's really tough at the same price point to think that people would make any choice but go battery electric. It's absolutely up to companies like Tesla to just keep the foot to the floor and keep developing vehicles that are so much more compelling that by 2030, there's no reason that anyone would be purchasing an internal combustion vehicle.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I mean, you also made a point earlier, which I guess I wanted to call out, which I think is important too, which is, step one is get these companies to stop lobbying against climate policy.
Mhm.
Step two is to get them to accelerate, their production of electric vehicles. And then step three, which I think we're going to be faced with sooner than we think, and you talked about, Thomas, is we need to be making EVs that are highly efficient because we only have so many resources in the world. And as we get more and more people, driving cars, we can't afford to have these, massive vehicles going down the road that are highly inefficient. We just don't have the resources.
Yeah, which also ties into another point. Do we really need all these people in vehicles? You look at the way towns are designed and public transit is set up. Like, how can you give people, especially with electric bikes and all these other last mile modes of transport that are coming on the market now, how can you make that more accessible and safer to use so that people don't need a vehicle or they don't need that second car in their family?
So, Jason, to kind of tie everything together, what can we do, at our level to help impact this issue?
Todd, I'm so glad you asked that question. For this week, what we want to do is to ask folks in the U.S. to look up and see whether their state is one of the 12 states that are pushing for a national phase out of internal combustion engines. So take a look. If your state's on the list, you're good to go. If your state's not on the list, send a note to your representative and tell them that, you want them to join the list. Well, that's a wrap for this week's short. Come back next week. We'll be back to full episodes. We have an interview where we'll be digging into the topic of overpopulation. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.